Hi there, and welcome to our webinar today on draft land-based net carbon inventory methods and results. We are going to get started a couple minutes after 1 o'clock. We know that it's always a little bit interesting getting onto WebEx since it's not something everyone uses every day. So we usually give people a little grace, so we'll probably get started around 1:02. If you want to grab a glass of water, take a quick stretch, and come back, we'll see you then. Okay, I am sure we still have some folks that are getting online and joining us via WebEx, but in the interest of time and with a tight agenda, I am going to go ahead and kick us off and get us started. My name is Christy Split. I'm the Government Relations Coordinator for the Oregon Department of Energy. And I am here today with two colleagues at the Oregon Department of Energy who will be leading most of the conversation today. That's Elizabeth Ruther, who you can call either Liz or Elizabeth, a policy analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy, as well as Jason Sauer, who's a research analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy. Our goal today is to report on results from our land-based net carbon inventory. We're really excited to share this work with you all today. And we know that there will be a lot of information presented. It's going to be a pretty dense webinar, but our goal is to do our best to manage questions so that you can be prepared to offer public comment on this particular report. So with that, I just want to say we'll be answering questions in the chat. So as we go along, that'll be something we'll be keeping our eye on. We'll answer questions that are specific to the topics as we're going through them. We'll have multiple breaks for questions, but there might be some bigger picture questions that we hang on to for a formal question period that we're having at the end of the webinar. With that, we can go to slide 2, and I'm happy to have my colleague Jennifer Villanueva, who's helped us with setting up our WebEx today, go through how to use WebEx.
Thank you for joining us. Today we'll be using WebEx. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the microphone and camera icon. To turn on your microphone or camera, please click on the icon and you should see it turn green. To raise your hand, you should see a smiley face icon that you can click on, and you should also see the option to raise your hand if you have a question or a comment. You can also add your question or your comment to the chat as well if you're comfortable doing so. Please remember that the chat is public and everybody can see the chat, and that this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube shortly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. We can go on to the next slide. So I mentioned a little bit about our purpose today. We're sharing findings from our draft report on greenhouse gas emissions and removals from Oregon's natural and working lands. I want to make sure folks know that as of today, we have posted this document, and Liz is going to go ahead and share the link to that in the chat so that people can kind of follow along, take a look, make sure you know where to swing back after this webinar today to read in full. And we also just wanted to let folks know that we're wanting to really be here today to share information and get your clarifying questions so that you will be prepared to submit comments and feedback. And at the end of this webinar, we'll share a little bit more information about how those comments will be collected, how we'll get them, the timeline for that. So this is really just intended not to necessarily get those public comments today, but to help you get your questions answered so that you are as prepared as possible to submit those comments. So That's our purpose. And if anyone has questions on the purpose, go ahead and share those in the chat and we'll get to them in a few minutes. And then with that, we can move on to our agenda. And you'll see here a very detailed agenda. And the reason we are pretty granular here is that we want you to know what's coming. We also want you to know that we'll be tackling this inventory, going through category by category, and hearing from subject matter experts from our contractor along the way. We plan on, after every 2 to 3 speakers, stopping for questions. So for example, we'll stop for questions after Liz speaks. We'll stop for questions after Jason and Katie speak, so on and so forth. So just know that even though you don't see a Q&A until the end, you'll see that Q&A marker wherever we're going to stop and allow questions on the last couple of topics here on the agenda. We also want you to see that we'll be running a tight ship. So you'll hear me come in and remind us to move on, keep our question and answers. When we do have those moments pretty tight, we'll be taking questions from the chat. And if we're unable to answer all the questions in the chat on a given topic, our subject matter experts will be answering those questions in the chat if we didn't get to them verbally. And then any questions more big picture that we haven't gotten to, we'll get to in that more formal period at the end. So hopefully that all makes sense. Definitely make sure you know how to use the chat. I know Jennifer just went over it. That little quote icon that looks like out of a cartoon, like a thought bubble. That's the chat to open it so you can follow along. If you are in a position where chat is challenging for you, there's also a little raised hand or raised fist icon that you'll see on your screen. And you can always use that to raise your hand and I can call on you. Most likely I'll try to use that for that formal question and answer period at the end, but I will keep an eye out for hands that are raised for folks that are unable to participate via chat. Liz, Jason, am I missing anything on setting up our Q&A and conversation today? If not, I'm very excited to turn things over to Liz.
I think that sounds great. Thank you very much. Happy Friday, everyone. My name is Liz. I'm glad you're here. I'm glad to be here today. It's been a wild ride to get to this point, including a corrupt master file just yesterday. So phew, and it's posted, and wanted to thank the project team too for all of their hard work and their time and attention this last month. It's been incredible. Before we dive into the inventory work, I actually wanted to provide a quick update regarding the workforce study related to natural climate solutions, which is also due December 31st. The study asked the primary research question: what are the workforce development and training solutions needed to support the adoption of natural climate solutions on natural and working lands? We are very excited about the study for several reasons. It represents the first study in Oregon to examine industries and occupations that currently implement or could implement natural climate solutions. While there have been studies focused on certain sectors like forestry and agriculture, this is the first look at Oregon's workforce through a natural climate solutions lens. The study involved detailed interviews with an array of workforce partners, including tribes, intertribal organizations, state agencies, employers, contractors, labor organizations, workers, nonprofits, landowners. It was incredible. And the project team discovered similarities, both in terms of opportunities and challenges across the land sectors, which can help guide changes to practices and policies to foster natural climate solutions implementation. And they generated many exciting potential steps to uplift and expand nature-based jobs that would help meet the state's policy to increase the pace and scale of natural climate solution implementation on Oregon's natural and working lands. So if some of you on this webinar were interviewed, thank you for the time and the expertise that you shared. We learned so much from you and others in the study. Regardless of your involvement, we hope you'll all consider joining us next week at the commission meeting on the 12th, where we'll discuss it. The study will be posted Monday on the same website as the draft inventory, and the public comment period will be December 8th to December 21st. Next slide. So starting off with the biggest picture, we'll put natural climate solutions work in the context of greater societal climate goals. Generally, climate action fits under 2 major categories necessary to meet those goals. We need to take action to rapidly reduce emissions and also rapidly increase actions that remove carbon that is already in the atmosphere. We need to do both of these things to stop global temperatures from rising. Strategies that remove carbon from the sky are generally called carbon removal strategies. While lands can emit greenhouse gases, which we'll talk much about today, land management strategies, or natural climate solutions that sequester carbon are generally included in this category. Strategies that are more geochemical or technological in nature are also in this category. However, natural climate solutions can be and are being deployed now, as we know, provide many benefits, not only carbon removal. They are a win-win-win and can help meet nature-based mitigation, adaptation, and resilience goals. Next slide. HB 3409 passed in 2023, which was a package of bills that did a lot of great things in relation to climate and resilience. Also passed the natural climate solutions section, and it did a number of things. It defined the term natural climate solutions, as you can see on the screen, and established state policy on natural climate solution implementation. And it also defined climate resilience and natural and working lands. It requested the Oregon Climate Action Commission to establish a statewide goal for carbon sequestration and storage, which will be occurring in April 2026. It also laid out work that provides the programmatic infrastructure to achieve the goals that the Commission will set, that you can see denoted by the arrows. The land-based net carbon inventory in green and the metrics work that is beginning now and will continue through June 30th of 2026, shown in blue, will help the state account for the actions it takes and to track progress toward the soon-to-be established goal. We just spoke briefly about the workforce study, which helps us understand who will implement the actions to achieve the goal. After we've established a goal, we can study how many workers may be needed to reach it. Next slide. The inventory and the natural climate solutions metrics work we were directed to complete establish two fundamental types of greenhouse gas accounting systems and will enable the state to understand if we are increasing removal of carbon from the atmosphere by tracking trends at the landscape scale, and also by tracking specific land management actions over time for specific natural climate solutions the state will be implementing. We are talking in depth about the inventory today. Next slide. This inventory will be helpful to us in a few ways. First, it allows us to establish long-term trends in greenhouse gas emissions and removals from the land starting in 1990. Since the inventory tells us about historical trends in emissions and removals, it can be used as the basis for projecting future emissions and removals from the land. For example, scenarios considering different land management policies or different rates of adoption for land management practices. When the inventory is updated routinely, it can help us track the success of policies and practices toward meeting our climate goals or estimate the impacts of major events on the land. All of this information can help inform future policymaking. At its broadest, this inventory demonstrates the important role Oregon lands play in greenhouse gas emissions and removals. Next slide. The statute also allows the chair of the commission to convene an advisory group. And the Natural and Working Lands Advisory Committee has been meeting since last March. This group has been incredibly engaged, prepared, and helpful. They have shared their perspectives and their contacts and their experiences, which has been really important for the work. I want to note here that we have worked to fill the tribal culture seat referenced in the table, but we have not yet identified someone for this role. This has been a consistent theme across similar bodies where the legislation includes a requirement for tribal membership, but it can be very hard to fill voluntary positions occurring during the workday and without compensation. If you're listening and you're interested in participating and have a lived or learned experience in tribal culture, customs, and government, please contact me. We would love to have this knowledge on the advisory committee. I'll speak a little bit more about the approach Odo and the Commission are using to coordinate and engage with Oregon's tribal nations in a couple of slides. Next slide. The Commission and Odo are also working in coordination with the 7 land managing agencies and DEQ who have provided data and review, and in the case of ODF and DEQ, guidance on inventory methods. We have a lot of gratitude for their help and partnership for this project. Next slide. The work on the inventory has involved a lot of engagement, and here we show a summary for the types and amounts of interactions that we've had to date. A few highlights from this slide. I noted our work with tribal nations. Odo and the Commission have created a parallel process to work to engage with and coordinate with tribal nations, which aims to be respectful of their sovereign status and time. It's occurring over a longer time period than any of the individual natural climate solutions projects that we are working on right now. The project team has worked with the advisory committee and the interagency working group, not just in meetings, but through emails and personal communication. And the project team, or Odo, spoke with academic researchers in Oregon and Washington, as well as nonprofits that have been conducting technical work in this area. Next slide. So this is just the first inventory. We will forevermore be improving this inventory in Oregon. Inventories are cyclical, and it's best to update them on a routine basis, whether that be every 2, 5, or 10 years. Per the NCS statute, Odo is responsible for maintaining and improving the inventory in coordination with the agencies and delivers a report to the legislature in even-numbered years on December 1st. We'll be updating the inventory in 2026 in line with the statute, and we plan to incorporate some new information, including modeling that will improve salinity estimates for Oregon's coastal wetlands, and the Department of Forestry will have new forest data in 2026, and we look forward to working with them to incorporate that data as well. Next slide. I think that does it for me. Christy?
We do not have any questions in the chat yet, so we'll just give people a second in case anyone has any questions. There will be some awkward silences for each of our Q&A breaks. That's the most charming thing I get to do up here, just to see if we do get any questions or see any hands get raised for folks who can't use the chat.
Well, we're just getting to the juicy stuff, so.
I know, no process questions, it looks like. So it's never too late to ask questions today, so feel free to just hold off or put them in the chat now as you have them. We'll probably move on to Jason presenting, and we'll have a Q&A break in the next few minutes to see what we have.
All right, thank you very much. Next slide, please. So hi, everyone. My name is Jason Sauer. I was introduced as at the beginning. I am a research analyst with the Oregon Department of Energy. And before we get into the details of the inventory, I wanted to talk about some of the key concepts and vocabulary that you'll be hearing a lot from our project team today. And so on this slide, you can see the 4 main pools of carbon that you'll find in Oregon's land. Above ground biomass on the top left consists of all living vegetative matter on the land, like trees, shrubs, and grasses. Below ground biomass on the bottom left consists primarily of the root systems of plants. Above ground biomass and below ground biomass will in this presentation sometimes be referred to together as just biomass, so keep that in mind that we're referring to both above ground and below ground. Dead organic matter on the top right refers to the parts of the land like dead trees, fallen branches, and leaves. And dead organic matter is also sometimes known as above ground dead biomass, but we will mostly be referring to it as dead organic matter in this presentation. Soil carbon is made up primarily of dead and disintegrated plant matter that has been incorporated into the soil. Some soils are richer in carbon than others, which can affect the processes through which they emit greenhouse gases. In this inventory, you're going to hear us talk about organic soils and mineral soils a lot. Just know that organic soils are rich in carbon, and when disturbed, such as through drainage or development, may become major sources of greenhouse gases. Mineral soils are generally poorer in carbon, but they may still be a substantial source of greenhouse gas emissions just through other processes. Next slide, please. Other key terms that you're going to hear a lot today include those on the screen. So carbon pools are systems that have the capacity to remove or emit carbon. An example of a carbon pool is like atmosphere or biomass or soil. Carbon stocks are the amount of carbon in a particular carbon pool. Carbon flux or stock change is the movement and exchange of carbon between different pools over time. I apologize if you can hear my dogs barking. Emissions refer to greenhouse gases that are released into the atmosphere, and you can see the emissions arrow on the right side of the screen in orange. Removals are greenhouse gases that are taken out of the atmosphere. You can see that in the green arrow on the left. Net flux refers to the balance between emissions and removals and is generally calculated as emissions minus removals. The term sequestration and storage refer to processes of removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and storing them. And then the greenhouse gases in particular that we're going to be talking about today are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. And you can see the chemical equations for them here. And those may be used as shorthand later on, so keep them in mind. But also don't hesitate to ask for clarification. Non-CO2 emissions generally refer to methane and nitrous oxide, so just the two forms of greenhouse gases that are not carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. So a broad overview of what an inventory does. So the land-based net carbon inventory in particular estimates carbon stocks, stock change, and resulting greenhouse gas flux, again, from those three chemical species of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, over time from Oregon's lands. The inventory also reports on estimates of greenhouse gas flux over time resulting from land remaining the same type. So for example, forest land remaining forest land, or land converted to another type, such as forest land, say converted to developed land. And the inventory reports in a unit of million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or MMTCO2e. And a quick note about that unit of million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This is a unit that's used to compare types of greenhouse gases with one another based on their warming potential relative to a molecule of carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide has a carbon dioxide equivalent of 1 because it's literally equal to carbon dioxide. But methane, for example, has a carbon dioxide equivalent of 28, meaning that it has a global warming potential of about 28 times that of a molecule of carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide has a carbon dioxide equivalent of around 298, meaning that a molecule of nitrous oxide has a warming potential of almost 300 times that of a molecule of carbon dioxide. The inventory also includes considerations of some land management practices, wildfires, and prescribed burns, and you'll hear the project team talk more about them later. Next slide, please. So the land categories that are included in this inventory, you saw a preview of it on the previous slide, but you can also see them more explicitly here. And so to account for all of the land in Oregon, we need to assign land to a particular category. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which developed the guidelines for producing national inventories, recommends the 6 land categories that are shown here. At the moment, Oregon does not have a statewide definition for these categories. We are basing our designations on the land cover classes used by what is called the National Land Cover Database land cover layer, which is published by the United States Geological Survey. The definitions are very similar to what is also used in the US National Greenhouse Gas Inventory, but not quite the same. In this inventory, the 16 land cover classes used in the National Land Cover Database are grouped into the 6 main land categories you see here. The definitions for these land categories are somewhat intuitive, but you can also find more details on the definitions in the report that we've published, particularly in Appendix A. Next slide, please. So once you establish these land categories in the inventory, generally what you do in building inventories, you start to layer on other types of data. So for example, because rates of plant growth, decay, and other processes of the land depend on climate, it's common to use a layer on ecoregions, which can serve to indicate general features of the climate, such as hotness or dryness. The ecoregion map that we used in the inventory comes from the Oregon Conservation Strategy, which is in turn based on the Environmental Protection Agency's map of what are called level 3 ecoregions. We have 8 major ecoregions in Oregon at this level, and that's because the conservation strategy combined 2 of the regions, the Snake River Plain and the Southern Basin and Range, which we have also done for this work. And that region is in the bottom right. Next slide, please. So as you may have guessed at this point, an inventory uses a lot of kinds of data, and they're very complicated, much like the land cover and ecoregion data I just spoke about. And the amount of data used may depend on the part of the state you're looking at, the data availability and the data quality and other factors. But in general, you start by establishing a few common data sets to give you a base level of understanding of the land. So in this map, we are showing you the land cover of the state derived from the National Land Cover Database. And so this is an example of one of these common statewide data sets, and it helps you understand what kind of biomass you have on the land. You then layer on top of this base layer additional data sets like ecoregion, which I just talked about, which can tell you about climate and how biomass accumulates in that climate, in addition to soil type layers, which could tell you about soil carbon and other soil processes. So from there, as you search around for data for the different land cover categories in the different parts of the state, you'll find specialized data sets and then sort of add them to the stacks that you see on the screen. So for example, if we start on the right and go counterclockwise, you may only have 3 basic layers of land cover, ecoregion, and soil type for a land cover type like grasslands. And so then you have to estimate your greenhouse gas flux based on those layers. But at the top in the top of the screen here, in developed land, you may have additional data on, say, tree canopy cover that can improve your estimates of biomass in urban trees beyond what you could estimate using only those first 3 layers. And in coastal wetlands on the left side of the screen, where in Oregon we have a dedicated team of academic researchers producing data and models to estimate carbon, you may have high resolution data on wetland perimeters and tidal extent that can help you produce some very sophisticated estimates of carbon. It's worth repeating that what you're seeing here is just an example of the kinds of data we used in the inventory. In reality, we always had more than the 3 layers of data that you're seeing. And also important, the data here are all spatial, but many of the data sets that we used in the inventory are not spatial. So for example, in cropland, we use tabular data, which is data that arrives to us in the form of like tables and reports or online. And these tables may summarize the acreage of crops planted within a county or something along those lines. But in addition to that, we also have other kinds of data that we use, such as anecdotal data from the extension offices of Oregon State University on typical crop rotations used in different parts of the state. And these other kinds of data are also used in the inventory, not just the spatial ones you see here. Next slide, please. Oh, okay, sorry, it switched over. Thank you. So through the discussions and meetings we had in building this inventory, the team reviewed over 30 state-level data sets to determine whether the information used in those data sets could be used in the inventory. Appendix D in the report contains the list of data reviewed, whether the data was used or not, and what improvements could be made to the data set for possible inclusion in the future. A common reason that a data set could not be used had to do with whether the data points were tracked through time, since we need to know changes in the characteristics of land in order to estimate emissions and removals over time, which is the function of this inventory. And so while the report on this inventory will be delivered to the legislature on December 31st, we always invite new data sets for review since this work is ongoing and we're going to be updating it indefinitely. Next slide, please. So natural and working lands inventories are complex and require the estimation of flux for many different land categories, pools within those categories, and species of greenhouse gases. Estimating these fluxes may require different data sets and methods, and some of those data sets and methods are more sophisticated or regionally accurate than others. As the project team developed its methodologies to produce estimates of greenhouse gas flux, we have used a system of tiers, which are established by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to note the level of sophistication of the methodologies and to help us identify which ones may be in need of improvement over time as we maintain and update the inventory. In general, tiers increase in complexity and accuracy from tier 1 to tier 3. So on the left side of the screen in tier 1, a tier 1 methodology might use data that's specific to a country that employs default emission factors that are collected by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which may be from studies that are global in nature and not necessarily targeted to a specific country. And this tier may not capture many of the land management practices that are actually happening on the land. In tier 2, which again is a step up in complexity and accuracy, we are again using data that are specific to a country, but we are using improved emission factors that may be more specific to the country where you are doing the inventory. And it may capture some more land management practices than in tier 1. In tier 3 methodologies on the far right, these methodologies use data that may be more specific to the state or the region. And a big change is that it will often employ models and field studies as opposed to emission factors. And both the data and the methods allow you to capture more land management practices that are missed in the lower tiers. So in this inventory, in some cases, we are only able to use tier 1 methodologies because of limitations in the data and methods, but in other cases, we were able to use tier 2 or tier 3. You'll hear the project team refer to the tier of analysis many times throughout this presentation, and this is what they're talking about. If you can't remember all of these details, just remember the arrow indicating the complexity and accuracy increasing from tier 1 to tier 2 to tier 3. Next slide, please. So an example of the methodological tier decision tree is shown on screen here. So basically the inventory team asks a basic question about like a land category such as croplands. And again, this is just an example. You know, we first do an assessment of the available data and methods available for cropland in the state of Oregon. And then we, when we're calculating emissions, we ask first, well, what's the soil type of the area that we're looking at? If the soil type is organic, which again is a carbon-rich soil, there's not a whole lot of studies or data about croplands on organic soil, so we may have to use default emission factors and information to produce tier 1 estimates of soil and biomass. But if you have a mineral soil, which is more deplete in carbon, you can then ask the question, well, what sort of crop are we looking at? Some crops have more information available than others, and the ones that have less information may not be able to go through a process-based model, and therefore we ended up producing tier 2 estimates of emissions and removals from soils and tier 1 estimates for biomass. If the crop has a lot of information or has a lot of studies that have been done about it, we can then model that crop and produce tier 3 estimates for soil and biomass, which you can see on the right. Next slide, please. So a couple of points to keep in mind. The first is that lands may emit greenhouse gases through natural processes. They don't have to be disturbed or altered by human activities in order to emit. Some of them just are always emitting to some degree. Lands can also produce net greenhouse gas emissions, but store additional carbon every year. So for example, the methane that wetlands emit may overwhelm the carbon dioxide in the plants are removing. That results in their characterization as a net emitter, but there may still be carbon that accumulates every year in those wetland soils. Relatedly, lands contain carbon stocks, and protecting those stocks is critical. If they are not protected, those stocks become emissions. A wetland that has been accumulating carbon for a long time in its soils can become a huge source of emissions if it is disturbed, such as through drainage or development. And with all of that said, the inventory focuses primarily on emissions and removals. That's what we are going to be talking about the most today. And the team will talk much less about carbon stocks, but there is more detail on carbon stocks included in the inventory report if you want more information. Next slide, please. So the project team is about to hop on and talk about the inventory. And just to give you a preview of how it's going to go, they're going to talk about the inventory scope, classification, more detail, and then statewide totals. And then we're going to go to a Q&A. And then we're going to start going through each of the different land categories. And after every 2 land categories that we go through, we'll do another 5-minute Q&A session or opportunity to ask your questions and provide answers. And then we will wrap up with an interpretation of the results. So with that, I will hand it over to Katie from the project team.
Great. Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate that, the overview of important concepts. I'm going to guide us into the next phase where we'll drill a little deeper into the inventory and the results. But first, I want to introduce myself and the project team. My name is Katie Goldman. I'm a senior fellow at the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. I'm going to be presenting to you today along with my other team members. Not everybody is shown here on the slide, but we have representatives from all of our organizations involved. Myself, Anup, and Olga are all affiliated with the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute, which is a nonprofit organization. We work really globally on building capacity for carbon accounting with the ultimate aim of improving our ability to manage, monitor, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Anup has been leading on the forestry section and co-leading on the grassland sections. Olga helped develop the biomass burning methodology and develop land approach. Olga also was the project manager for this fairly complex project. That was a big task in and of itself, even though it doesn't say that on the slide. That was a big part of her role as well. We're joined by Robert Parkhurst, who is the principal at Sierra View Consulting. Robert and his associates developed the methodology for estimating emissions in croplands, as well as the soils on grasslands. So Robert and Anup collaborated on the grassland section, which we'll tell you about. And then Lena Capise is with Sylvestrum and Associates, and she's representing the team of wetlands experts who helped develop and produce the wetlands results. We are all, I can say, really happy to be here today and present the results of this report to you. It's been a privilege and a challenge to prepare the first edition of Oregon's Natural Working Lands Inventory, and I'm excited to tell you about it. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So first, I just want to hit on some elements about the scope of the inventory. What is it and what's included? And I think Jason's given us a really good introduction, but just to go a little bit deeper, the inventory that we're presenting today accounts for all of the land across the state, divided into those 6 land categories. One of those categories, other land, does not have emissions and removals. It just helps us do a full account of land area over time. So you won't be hearing about emissions from that category, but the others we will focus on. We've aligned our work with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change inventory guidelines. This is the preeminent set of standards for developing inventories. They're used by nations all over the world to report under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The US EPA follows these guidelines to prepare the national inventory, and we frequently looked to the EPA inventory as a model for how to prepare and produce these results. And some of the members of our team are also authors on the IPCC guidelines, so we have good knowledge of those, and we're happy to be able to work to align this work with them. The IPCC guidelines, they developed that tiered approach that Jason told you about. They also ensure that we're upholding some important principles like not omitting any sources or sinks, and not counting things more than once, or double counting, as they say. So in following these guidelines, it helps us uphold rigor and comparability with other inventories as well. Jason's mentioned that we're accounting for emissions and removals from carbon stocks on land, as well as other greenhouse gases that are only emitting sources, such as methane and nitrous oxide. We, all told across these land categories and the specific sources and sinks within these land categories, we've estimated 49 independent quantifications or estimates of emissions. So that's a significant amount of quantification. For each one of those, we've identified data, developed a methodology, and implemented it for the first time for your state. We're happy to be able to share it with you. There are 3 different tier levels represented. We were able to accomplish about 9 methodologies at Tier 3, which is a significant accomplishment, many at Tier 2, and still some at Tier 1. And over time, Jason and his team will be hopefully able to build out more Tier 2 and Tier 3 methodologies as part of the inventory improvement plan. As has been mentioned before, this inventory covers the time series starting in 1990 all the way to almost present day. This is fairly standard for inventories, and it produces an annual estimate, so estimating emissions and removals every year in between 1990 and present day. Next slide, please. Just to also talk about some of the, I would say, strengths and limitations of the methodologies. We want to make some notes before we dive into the details. We use the National Land Cover Database to identify land area in these different categories over time. It classifies land from remote sensed imagery, and it's based on land cover and doesn't necessarily capture function and management and other details. And in some cases, additional data can help us provide that information, but not in all cases. So there have been some limits that we've come up against because this is a land cover data set. But it is really excellent wall-to-wall coverage that is repeated over time. So it really meets some of the important criteria for greenhouse gas inventory. And it is supplementable. One key gap that I want to point out from using the NLCD data, we were not able to feel confident in the ability of the data to classify certain types of land transitions, and in particular, forest land to grassland and grassland to forest land. So forest being converted into grassland use, or grasslands being converted into forest land use. Given the I guess the imagery produced, we weren't able to discern whether or not these changes were permanent that we were seeing in the data. And so at this point, we've decided to not include those particular transitions. And that is a key area for improvement in the future. And each of our leads will say a little bit more about that, who are affected by that. So that's a good cue up to the fact that there are gaps and we need to make assumptions to prepare an inventory, especially the first time. So in some cases, data are collected periodically every 5 years, but we're providing an inventory that can be produced every 2 years. So there needs to be an ability to take 5-year intervals and interpolate and make assumptions about what happened in between those 5 years so that an inventory can be produced every 2 years. And the inventory provides annual data. So there is some interpolation that happens and some extrapolation. For example, the last NLCD data layer we used was from 2021. So we just assumed there were no further changes in land area by category from that point forward. So that's the type of assumption we need to make. Another important assumption relates to organic soils. Organic soils are rich in organic matter. They're frequently wet. It's like peatlands, bogs, fens, swamps, wetlands. These types of soils, in order to be developed or to grow crops on them, typically are drained. And that process results in methane emissions. And you're going to see that's an important source for the state. I think I just lost the slides. And so for this inventory, we've had to make assumptions about when organic soils have been drained. And so we've decided that the best assumption at this point in time is that all organic soils appearing in croplands are drained, and all organic soils appearing in developed land are drained. That's an underlying assumption, and that drives the emissions we're going to show you in a moment. When organic soils appear on other land categories, we do not assume they're drained. So that means there are no methane emissions when it's not drained, and there are methane emissions when it is drained. All of these assumptions can be looked at over and over again and refined, as well as finding additional data to improve the inventory over time. I think we can move to the next one. And now is it's time to move into the results of our work. And first, I'm going to start us out with a picture of land use in Oregon over time. These are the distribution of acres in our different land categories, looking at 1990 in the green bars and 2021 in the teal blue bars. And as you can see, grasslands is the dominant category of land, followed by forest lands, croplands, wetlands, and a small bit of developed land. The amounts of land in these land categories remains fairly constant over time. You see some small increases and small decreases. For example, there's a slight increase in grasslands, less than 1% increase in the area of grasslands. And there is a slight loss of forest land and croplands and wetlands with a corresponding increase in developed land. This is looking over the full time series. As I'll show you on the next slide, we looked at more frequent transitions of land, and I'm going to show you a picture of that next. But overall, I want you to understand that most of the land stays in this sort of stable situation, and that really drives the trends that you're going to see next. But it is important because of the way carbon cycling is impacted by land use and land use change. We do need to look at both land staying in the same use over time and land transitioning. And so what you're looking at here is a rather complicated diagram, but it is meant to illustrate a point, which I will share with you now, which is, so let me show you how to read this diagram. On the left-hand side, this is a breakdown of the acres in 1990. So at the top, you see that there were 27.3 million acres of grassland in 1990. That's represented by that yellow box. Moving forward in time to the right side of the diagram, which represents 2021, and that's about the same number of acres of grassland. So that yellow box is all of the land that sort of stayed the same. But if you look at the bottom of the box, there are some lines peeling off and moving to other categories. So we do have land leaving grassland and becoming cropland during this time period. And we have other lands, for example, cropland, leaving cropland and moving into grassland. And that's the other lines coming in to the grassland box. So we've got land moving out and land moving in. I'm sharing this with you not because these numbers and these are particularly important for you to understand, but so that you know we've tracked these changes at finer intervals over time in order to produce the inventory results you're going to see today. I think with that, we can move to the next slide. So all of our work across those 49 categories are summarized here in this one figure. This represents the full inventory of emissions and removals in the land in Oregon from 1990 to 2024. It's a stacked bar chart, so each bar represents emissions. So positive numbers are emissions and negative numbers are removals. Each colored bar represents a land category. So the gray bars that you see below the zero line, those are forest land emissions and removals, net emissions and removals, or as you see here, net removals. There are also grassland, which is the peach color, also net removals. Above the line, above the zero line, we see cropland in green, developed land in purple, and wetlands in blue, as well as another category that we've separated out from the land because it affects more than one land category. It affects specifically grassland and forest land, and that's burning, biomass burning from wildfires and prescribed burns. That's the red box. And so each year we estimate, we roll up all of our estimates of emissions for those categories. We add it all up and we get a net value. And year over year, the land in Oregon is a net sink. There's more greenhouse gases being removed and stored in biomass, in particular in biomass on forests and grassland and in harvested wood products, than there are emitted from the other sources in the other land categories. This is a consistent pattern over time. However, you may notice that the amount of the removals occurring has decreased between 1990 and present day. And there could be a lot of reasons for this, including the fact that further back in time, we have less certainty in some of the data. So there is, I would say, increased uncertainty the further back you go in the time series. So that also could be contributing to this trend. Another thing I want to point out, and maybe this is, you're seeing this too, in the red box, which is burning, there's sort of an increasing occurrence of red closer to present day, which means that biomass burning is happening more frequently and it's creating more emissions. And that is largely due to climate change. So this is something we will talk more about in detail in a moment. And I think those are the main takeaways for this graph at this point in time, and we can move on to the next one. This is a slightly different way of looking at the same information. This is just 2024, so it's a snapshot of 1 year, but this pattern is more or less the same in all years of the inventory. And what you're looking at is the collapsed across land categories. It's the emissions from each one of these sources across all land categories. So aggregated for the entire state, not disaggregated by land category. We can see where the largest sources and removals of emissions occur in the land across the state. And the way you read this graph, similar to the previous one, emissions are positive, but this time they're on the right side of the graph. And removals are negative, and they're on the left side of the graph. And I'm going to read it from the top to bottom, because at the top of the graph, what you see is the largest source of emissions are drained organic soils. And I made kind of a big deal about drained organic soils earlier because it is one of the larger categories. And remember, we made some assumptions about when and where organic soils are drained, and this may be something to look at in more detail in future inventories. The next largest source of emissions is methane from wetland soil, followed by biomass burning, which I also mentioned in the previous slide as something that's been increasing over time, followed by mineral soils. Mineral soils are prevalent in cropland and grassland. Between those two land categories, mineral soils generally hover around 0. So sometimes they are a source and sometimes they are a sink. And they stay close to 0 over time. We also estimated nitrous oxide emissions from the commercial application of fertilizer on forests. I want to note that fertilizer application in cropland is covered by another inventory prepared by the Department of Environmental Quality, the sector-based inventory, which has been produced already a number of times for the state of Oregon. So we didn't want to count that twice. So we've excluded fertilizer emissions on croplands from this particular inventory, but you can find that data in a different report. So this nitrous oxide from fertilization only refers to forests. It's so small, it's such a small source, you can't really see it on this graph. There's another even smaller source that we didn't include on this graph. It's so small, and that is from aquaculture. And I'm not sure we have more to say about that. It was a very small source. We estimated it, and it's so tiny it's not on this figure, but it is described in the report. Okay, so now we're moving from emissions to removals, and the first category of removal is dead organic matter in wetlands. It was only looked at in wetlands in a disaggregated way, which is why it stands alone here. And it's a relatively small but consistent sink. This is followed by carbon removals and sequestration in wetland soils. So remember, wetland soils are both a source of methane and a sink of carbon dioxide. So they drive both processes, and it's important to understand that both occur, and that the carbon dioxide removals do offset to some extent the methane emissions that naturally occur in wetlands. And then we're down to our two largest categories of removals, and that is harvested wood products and biomass in forests and grassland. This is the perennial biomass on the land. And with that, let's move on. I'm just going to quickly recap the main takeaways and let our subject matter experts tell you more details about each one of these land categories. But the main takeaway is that there are net removals from the land in Oregon. They've decreased from 95 million metric tons. So that's the net value of emissions minus removals. 95 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent in 1990 to 49 million metric tons carbon dioxide equivalent in 2024. That means more carbon dioxide is removed and stored in biological carbon pools than emitted from carbon pools and other sources. And this is primarily due to carbon being sequestered and stored in forest biomass and harvested wood products. Drained organic soils is a larger source of emissions, followed by methane emissions, which are a source and a sink. Emissions from prescribed burning and wildfires are also important to look at. They are increasing due to climate change. And finally, croplands is a source of emissions, tends to be a source of emissions, and grasslands tends to be a sink of emissions. And then let's go to the next slide. And I'm going to tell you a couple things, some limitations, remind you about some limitations of the data. The land cover data set we used, which was to estimate the amount of area in these different categories, is currently the best available data. It does have limitations that will be explored in the future. Anytime that research on the ground in Oregon can improve data on carbon fluxes, that would enhance the robustness and accuracy of the inventory. And with that, I'm gonna pause. That was a lot of material. And between my information and Jason's, I think we're pausing for a quick Q&A.
We
Thank
sure
you.
are. If you go to the
Thank
next
you.
slide, that's what'll happen. Thanks. So we do have a question in the chat, and I encourage others to go ahead and put them there. And don't forget, you can raise your hand if putting something in the chat is a barrier. We want to hear from you. So this is a question from Dean Moberg. In the distributions of emissions and removals in the 2024 chart, and we could go back to that slide if Jennifer can help us get there. Biomass burning emissions don't include CO2. Why is that? In the same chart, there is no for carbon stored in soils. Is that included in the biomass bar?
Those are great questions. We will cover that in more detail, but quickly, I will say that the carbon dioxide emissions from burning are accounted for in the carbon stock changes in biomass. So it's to avoid double counting of the loss of carbon dioxide. We don't include it in the biomass burning section. So it is inherently included in the removals from biomass. The question about soils, so we have soils broken out in a couple different places here, and that's where the information on soils resides. We talk about drained organic soils, so that's a source of emissions. We talk about wetland soils, which are a source of methane and a removal of carbon dioxide. Mineral soils is where you will have both emissions and removals of carbon. So any carbon sink in soils, in mineral soils, that's probably what you're looking for, and that will be represented by that small bar there. We will see more details on that when we talk about croplands and grassland, and you will see the magnitude and how it changes over time, but that does encapsulate carbon stored in soils. I hope that answers the questions.
I think so.
Okay.
And we'll hear more about it too, like you said.
Yeah.
So I think that we have a question in the chat, but I'm going to call on Tim Miller. Jennifer, could you take Tim off of mute, and then we'll see if the question in the chat will be answered in a bit, or if we want to take it now. There, Tim, you should be able to talk now. Maybe not. Yes. Hi. Oh, Tim, we can't really hear you. You're off mute, but your connection's kind of rough. Go ahead, give it a shot. You sound like a robot, but I can understand you.
Okay. Great info, thank you. Two questions. One is, does the net totals mean that we are increasing the stock of GHGs stored in our lands by like 49 million metric tons a year? Am I understanding that correctly? And the comment about the difficulty of tracking transitions from grassland to forest land and back and forth. And does that mean that if we have a clear cut or some very, very heavy harvest of products, we wouldn't be able to see that in this analysis? Those two.
Let's see if I can. I'm not sure I got the first question entirely. I'm not sure I heard it entirely.
I got it for what it's worth. I think he was asking about kind of the bottom line. Like, is it really that I'm worried I'll get the actual facts wrong, but he was basically like double checking his understanding about the maybe 49 million. Anyway.
Yes.
Did somebody else catch it better that knows the content better than me?
I think so. What's happening is each year a certain amount of carbon gets accumulated in the biomass of forests, and so the numbers on the chart are the amount accumulated per year, and then that is added to the existing stock, which is not shown on the chart. What we're looking at is accumulations per year, and in 1990, there was more accumulated and stored in biomass per year than in 2024. And we will get into that. So maybe after Anup talks about forestry, if you don't feel that question's been answered, let's come back to it. And then the second question.
Tim, we really can't hear you. I'm so sorry.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
Yeah.
What was the second question? Did somebody? I don't have the second question jotted down.
It was about the transition between grassland and forest and grassland that you mentioned. And so I think we actually should keep that until the second question and answer segment, or those two segments, and then we'll circle back because it'll be we're talking about that.
If it's not answered. And Rand, it's so good to see your name. We'll do the same thing for your question because we actually think the answer to your question will come up. And if it doesn't, then we'll circle back to it after we hear more about forestry in a couple of turns from now. All right. Well, with that, we will turn the page from Q&A. Tim, feel free to email me with questions too, like when you're all done, and we can make sure we get answers back since we're having some connection issues. And passing it on to the next person.
Yeah, it's still me, but I'm just going to kick it off and pass it on to Anup here in a second. But I want to let you know how this is going to go. Each of our speakers, they are experts in their land category. They are the ones who developed the methods and implemented the methods. They will be able to answer, hopefully, your questions in more detail. They're going to give you information on the data and methods used at a summary level, but there's a lot more information in the report. They're going to present key results and summary findings and potentially hit on future improvements. Yes, and mention some areas to improve the inventory in the future. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Anup to talk about our forests or your forests in Oregon.
Thank you, Kate. Next slide, please. Yeah, I'm going to present the methodology and results from the forest land sector. Our forest land inventory methodology uses National Land Cover Database, NLCD maps, forest group type map, forest inventory analysis, FIA plots, and soil type. NLCD groups forests into three major classes: deciduous forests, coniferous, and mixed forests, but forest analysis plot, FIA plots, are based on forest group types. Therefore, we regrouped each NLCD forest class by forest group type and calculated carbon emissions and removals by forest group type. There are 17 forest group types in Oregon. And then we use the time series NLCD data to track two critical dynamics. First, how much land remains consistently forested versus transition to other uses. And second, how much land is converted from non-forest use into forest use. We follow the same harvested wood product model that Oregon Department of Forest uses, ensuring consistency with state reporting. And we also estimated emissions from fertilizer applied on commercial forests. May I have a next slide, please? Yeah, the graph on the right in this slide tells an important story about Oregon's forest as a climate asset. The green bars show forest biomass, trees actively removing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it as they grow. The negative value means the carbon is being pulled out of the air. The orange bars represent carbon stored long-term in harvested wood products like buildings and furniture. The forest carbon removals or removal of CO2 dropped from about 80 million metric tons in 1990 to 50 million metric tons in 2024, a 38% decline. Similarly, carbon stored in harvested wood products fell from about 25 million metric tons to 8 million metric tons, reflecting decreased timber harvest over recent decades. Emissions from fertilizer used in commercial forests and from mineral soils during the cropland to forest conversions are both minimal, and they're hard to see on the graph. Despite these declines, Oregon's forests remain a substantial net carbon sink, continuing to play a critical role in state's climate strategy. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the emissions and removals by Oregon's major forest type groups. 3 forest groups make up most of Oregon's forests. Douglas fir at about 50%, ponderosa pine at 20%, and fir, spruce, mountain hemlock group at 17%. The carbon removals followed a similar pattern. Douglas fir and the spruce and hemlock group provided the largest carbon removals, particularly from 2016 onwards. We're also observing some changes over time here. Ponderosa pine shows a notable decrease in carbon removal. Most other forest groups also show gradual decrease in carbon removals. Notably, FIA plot data shows that aspen birch, mixed conifer, and western oak forest groups experienced negative carbon accumulations between 2001 and 2022. This means that these forest types shifted from removing carbon to releasing it during this period. One technical note, data before 2000 uses a static accumulation rate because FIA measurements were not available to evaluate temporal change during this time. With this, I'll pass to Olga for hardwood.
Thank you, Anup. Yeah, my name is Olga, and I helped on this particular category in the forest land, so I'll just give you a brief overview. Here we're looking at the harvested wood products category and the resulting carbon dioxide emissions and removals. We use the same methodology that is used by the Oregon Department of Forestry. So these are essentially the same results that you may have seen already published previously, but presented in the inventory format. The graph shows the emissions and removals due to the carbon flux in these 2 pools that are included. One is products in use, so lumber that is used in houses, wood furniture, paper products. And then the second pool is solid waste disposal sites, which contains products that are discarded after use and stayed in landfills. Overall, this category is a net sink, so it's removing carbon from the atmosphere. In 1990, the net removal was approximately 24 million metric tons of CO2e. And in 2024, the removal declined to approximately 8 million metric tons of CO2e. And this is primarily driven by reduction in harvest in Oregon over the last 30 years. There are two periods when the products and use pool acted as an emitter, and it's primarily driven by reduction in harvesting. So less timber is contributing to that pool, and therefore the stock change looks like an emission. The solid waste disposal site pool remains approximately steady at 5 to 8 million metric tons each year. So it keeps that much harvested wood product carbon in the landfill every year in Oregon. And when you're looking for more information about this particular category, you will find it in the forest land category section of the report. Back to Anup for some takeaways and conclusions.
Thank you, Olga. So I'll just present the summary of findings. Our carbon analysis revealed three key findings. First, Oregon's forests are a significant climate asset, removing approximately 50 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent annually. To keep in prospect, which is equivalent to offsetting emissions from roughly 10 million passenger vehicles. Second, the harvested wood products contribute an additional 8.3 million metric tons of carbon removals in 2024, representing a carbon store long-term in buildings, furniture, and other wood products. As harvest levels decrease over the recent decades, wood product carbon storage also declined. This highlights the dual climate benefit of Oregon's working forests, standing forest growth plus durable wood product storage. Third, forests are critical to Oregon's climate mitigation strategy. The forest sector's 58 million metric tons of annual carbon removals, combining standing forests and wood products, is a cornerstone of the state's greenhouse gas reduction pathway. And protecting and enhancing these forest carbon sinks remain a top priority. Next slide, please. Here, moving forward, we have identified three priority improvements. First, enhance NLCD classification by integrating multiple forest monitoring datasets. Cross-referencing several data sources will help reduce uncertainties and create more consistent time series for tracking Oregon's forest carbon trends. Second, work with Department of Forests to evaluate available statewide layers and identify the best forest extent layer. This ensures building carbon estimates on the most accurate spatial foundation possible. Third, conduct error propagation analysis to provide confidence intervals for CO2 estimates meeting professional standards for greenhouse gas inventory reporting. These improvements will enhance both the accuracy and credibility of Oregon's forest carbon assessments. With that, I'm going to stop here. And next slide, please.
Yes, thank you. This is Olga again. I'm going to talk about the category of biomass burning. So it follows forest because it's really tightly connected to forest lands, although we are also looking at emissions that occur on grasslands as well. So we're including methane and nitrous oxide emissions from wildfires, as well as from prescribed burn activities. And as was already kind of specified, we're not estimating carbon losses related to these burns because they're captured by looking at the carbon fluxes from biomass in these land categories. We're also not reporting emissions from agricultural residue burning here. This is already reported in the sector-based inventory that's compiled by the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. The data sources that we're using include both state level data as well as national data. For wildfires, we're combining several data sets together. These include Oregon Department of Forestry historic burn perimeters, as well as 3 other national data sets: the Monitoring Trends in Burn Severity burn perimeter data, MODIS burn data product, and the National Incident Feature Service burn perimeter data. These data sets are all produced using different methodologies, and therefore they cover slightly different sets of fires, although there's quite a bit of overlap. And so the approach we used to estimate the emissions was to actually use all of these and then estimate emissions and obtain an average to get a representative number for the state. These estimates are produced using U.S. Forest Service Consume model, which is the same tool that is used by the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. And from prescribed burns, the emissions are estimated using data that comes from Oregon Department of Forestry Smoke Management Program, which documents all prescribed burn activities that occur. That data set begins in 2010, so we had to fill some data gaps in the early years of the inventory, and we apply emission factors that are specific to the region to estimate emissions. Next slide, please. So here you see the results for wildfires, and you can see from the graphs on the right is that both the area affected by wildfires and the emissions that are resulting from those wildfires are increasing over time. The data on these graphs is disaggregated by forest land and grassland, and we could see a clear increasing trend, but we also see a lot of fluctuation due to the episodic nature of these events. In 1990, the total emissions were about 0.17 million metric tons, and by 2024, we see that number increase to 2.39 million metric tons, which is approximately a 10-fold increase or more. This trend reflects warmer, drier conditions and increased fuel loads, which lead to more frequent and intense fires. There is a growth in burn area, especially since mid-2000s, with several high emission years such as 2002, 2012, 2018, and 2020. And the 2024 fire parameters are also quite high. The forest land component dominates the total emissions because there's more fuel that is available for burning on forest land. And overall, these are episodic but significant sources of emissions and drive interannual variability in emissions in the land sector. Next slide, please. Here you can see the emissions associated with prescribed burns. Because the data set begins in 2010, as I mentioned, the time series preceding that year is just based on the average of the available data, and that's why it just looks like kind of a flat line. In 2010 and 2011, there's some outliers due to data gaps. There's definitely some fluctuation in the data, but not a clear trend that is apparent. And if you look at just 1990 and 2024 numbers, it looks like it's that hasn't changed, and it sort of emits about 0.13 or 1.14 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. Also, please note the scale on the white axis here. This is, of course, just a fraction of the emissions that result from wildfires, especially towards the latter part of the time series that you saw on the previous slide. Next slide, please. So what are the main takeaways from these results? There's a consistent increase in wildfire emissions, which underscores the need to integrate fire management and risk reduction into climate and land use strategies, because these events could lead to such high emissions as the area affected and emissions increase. The second takeaway is that while these are natural disturbances, their increasing magnitude highlights the climate change and land management really interact quite a bit and shape the state carbon balance And thirdly, prescribed burn emissions are approximately 5% of wildfire emissions, especially in the late 2020s. In the 2020s, part of the time series, and of the different prescribed burn activities, those that are done post-harvesting activities contribute the most to the emissions. Next slide, please. So to improve the estimates in the future for wildfires, improving data collection at the state level would enhance the completeness of the burn area mapping and reduce some of the discrepancies between the state and the national data sets. This is already the data in the 2020s is much better aligned, and so it would be good to continue in that regard. For prescribed burns, if the state collects geospatial data on burn activities, that would enable more advanced estimation methodology that is used for wildfires, and kind of using the same tool that's used for wildfires, which is called the Wildland Fire Emission Inventory System, WFEIS, that you see listed here on the slide. And hand in hand with that, the team that produces this tool and manages this tool would be able to support the state team in improving the estimates and improving the model parameters that are used to derive these estimates. So we encourage that collaboration to further advance the accuracy of the estimates in the future for the state. I'm not sure if there's a pause for questions.
There is. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And we do have one question. So the question, we answered another question in the chat if folks want to look up and see that. But we also have one that doesn't have an answer yet that seems perfect. Over what time period are harvested wood product removals assessed? And additionally, wouldn't harvested wood product deposited in landfills decay over time, creating emissions? And how are those emissions assessed?
Yeah, those are great questions. So the model uses harvest data starting from 1906 and kind of propagates that amount of wood biomass that's collected and moves into this harvested wood product pool starting, going back more than 100 years. So that, and then as each year there's in addition to that harvested wood product pool. For landfills, yes, absolutely, there is decay of material in landfills that occurs, and those emissions are actually captured in the waste sector, and that is also in the sector-based inventory. And so we did not include them here to avoid the double counting.
Got it. Really appreciate that answer. Thank you, Olga and Anoop. I think we are ready to move on to our next topic, but we'll keep an eye on any questions on these two topics that come up in the chat, or we can talk about it at the end. So moving on to cropland. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Hello, my name is Robert, and I will be taking you through cropland and grassland here. So 3 different approaches were used in the quantification of carbon flux for croplands. The first was for crops on which significant research has been conducted, like wheat, alfalfa, and potatoes. The second approach was for crops without extensive carbon flux research, and the final method was for croplands on organic soils. We calculated the carbon fluxes for above ground biomass, such as orchards and vineyards, soil carbon for all crops on mineral soil, and soil carbon, nitrous oxide, and methane for crops on organic soils. As mentioned before, because nitrous oxide from the use of fertilizer is part of the state's sector-based inventory, it was not included in this inventory to avoid double counting. We used the National Land Cover Database, the EPA Level 3 ecoregion, and USDA census data to delineate cropland areas for crops grown throughout the state. We also used USDA Soil Survey Geographic Database, or SURGO, to identify organic soils. The calculation method to quantify the carbon flux from organic soils came from methods developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The carbon flux from all mineral soils was calculated using guidance from USDA, which was originally published in 2014 and updated in 2024. And more on these methods and their associated tiers are on the next slide. So you can see here, we've got the tier 2 and tier 3 crops delineated. So for crops with significant carbon flux research, the USDA has developed quantification guidance, which has then been incorporated into a tier 3 model called Comet Farm. This model allows for detailed analysis of those crops, including crop rotation, the planting and harvest dates, yield, cultivation practices, and fertilizer application forms and rate. And you can see over on the right-hand side, the crop rotations that were modeled as a part of our analysis. For crops without extensive carbon flux data, the USDA guidance has detailed equations that include considerations of soil type, climate, cultivation practices, and fertilizer application forms and rates. Cultivation practices and the use of organic matter, not at the level of forms and rates. And you can see those in the tier 2 table there, about 22 crops in that area. The good news is that more than 80% of the cropland in Oregon can be modeled using the Comet Farm program. And you can see that in the graph down at the bottom, where about 83% were covered in the tier 3 model approach, about 9% in the tier 1, the IPCC calculation approach, and then 8% in the USDA tier 2 approach. Next slide, please. Oregon's croplands have been a consistent source of emissions since 1990, with the most significant source of emissions coming from cropland remaining as cropland. Emissions from remaining cropland range from 7.7 million metric tons of CO2e in 1990 to 6.6 million metric tons in 2024. The emissions the emissions trend for lands converted to cropland are relatively small, but gradually increased over the time period, ranging from 0.77 million metric tons in 1990 to just over 2 million metric tons in 2024. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail on the next slide. Excuse me. On the slide, you can see the data broken down in more detail. The top table is for land remaining cropland, and the bottom is for land converted to cropland. In 1990, the most significant source of emissions came from organic soils, which has gradually decreased from 6.4 million metric tons in 1990 to 5.9 in 2024. Mineral soils show more variability, primarily due to the weather. Nevertheless, emissions from mineral soils have also gradually decreased from 1.28 million metric tons CO2e in 1990 to 0.74 in 2024. Finally, cropland biomass, such as Christmas trees, pear orchards, and vineyards, are neither a significant source or removal over the inventory period. The largest areas of organic cropland soils are located in the Willamette Valley region at about 23%, or about 340,000 acres, followed by the Klamath Mountain region at about 9%, or 26,000 acres. Next slide, please. So here we'll go through the key takeaways from the inventory. As we just saw, organic soils are the largest category of carbon flux and represent a significant source of emissions. The largest source of emissions, and only as is the largest source of emissions, in only about 9% of all cropland acres, these lands offer a potential opportunity for intervention, such as restoration to wetlands, shifting from cropland to grassland, or changing the cropping systems. While total cropland acre on mineral soils has decreased about 20% between 1990 and 2024, the carbon emissions have decreased at twice the rate at about 40%. While the exact reasons are complex and require more detailed analysis, the largest drivers appear to be located in counties in the warm temperate zones of Oregon. Finally, the carbon stored in biomass by orchards and vineyards, as we stated before, is negligible, and it has remained relatively constant over the time period. Moving on to the next slide on future improvements. We have two recommendations for the improvement of the cropland inventory. The first is to improve the collection of agricultural management data down to the county level. This includes information such as tillage, types of tillage, no-till, strip-till, things of that nature, cover cropping, as well as species of cover crop, plant date, termination date, and fertilizer practices. While the state does have fertilizer data it's at the state level and can't be attributed down to the counties and the specific crops. Second recommendation is to improve the state level data on drainage practices related to drained organic soils, and this will lead to more improved emissions factors for those soils. Let's go on to the next slide. Wow, we're opening up to Q&A here. So.
Yes, thank you. Anybody have any questions on croplands? We do have a question. Were any crops climate positive, or did all crop types result in net annual emissions?
That's an excellent question. There are some places in some counties where there are small net removals, but it's really buried deep down in the data. And I would have to go back and take a look at where those are. And I do believe that biomass, of course, was a net positive, but it is relatively small.
Okay. Thank you. All right, that's all we have for now. We're gonna we're gonna have questions, I think, right after grasslands as well. So if anybody has any croplands questions that are still up, we'll go ahead and chat about those.
Fantastic. Well, I will continue on to take you through grasslands. And so the grassland and rangeland inventory uses a comprehensive multi-source approach to capture the full picture of Oregon's grasslands and rangeland ecosystems. So what we've done is we stratified the rangelands areas by 3 key dimensions: vegetation, soil characteristics, and geographic location, using the same level 3 ecoregions data that we did in the croplands area. This stratification is really important because carbon storage varies dramatically between ecoregions, even for the same vegetation types. So as a part of this, we track both the above ground biomass as well as the soil carbon pools. Our analysis integrates 3 primary data sets. As we said, just as we have in other areas, the NLCD provides the spatial extent and land cover classification, as well as the EPA ecoregions give us ecological content. And then the SURGO database gives us soil carbon down at the county level. We use the rangeland analysis program to derive carbon density parameters for shrubs and perennial grasses, and the Comet Farm program to calculate soil carbon. Like with carbons, we calculate emissions from organic soils using methods developed by the IPCC. And finally, we validated everything through consultation with local rangeland management experts who understand the on-the-ground conditions, such as dates on which grazing occurs. Next slide. So here we're going to see the results of this. So grasslands typically function as a net carbon sink. That is, that they're actively removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Now, as we've noted before, this data does not include forest land converted to grassland because we're unable to determine the area of forest converted to grasslands due to some of the misclassification of the harvest data in Oregon as forest conversion to grassland. And this is in the NLCD data. However, what you'll see here is that the removal capacity isn't uniform. We see significant both regional differences driven by participation patterns and vegetation types, as well as year-to-year variability that also reflects climate conditions. So in drought years, you're going to see reduced carbon accumulation, while in wetter years, you'll see it enhanced. The mineral soils underlying these grasslands are particularly important because they constantly sequester carbon over time, except in the case of conversions to other types, such as a conversion of grasslands to croplands. So the CO2 emissions and removals varied by year, especially for biomass carbon. So let's take a closer look at the biomass carbon on the next slide. So here you can see a regional graph of the changes in biomass over time. The Blue Mountains and the Northern Basin Range are the strongest drivers of removals in the post-2018 period, which is not surprising because these are the largest grassland areas in the state. The Columbia Plateau, the 3rd largest region of grassland in the state, fluctuates between both removals and emissions. Over the 35-year time period, we see grassland biomass varying between a source and a sink, starting as a sink between 1990 and 1993, switching to a source between 1994 and 2006, and then varying between a sink and a source through 2016, and then finally becoming a net sink starting in 2017. It's difficult to determine the specific reasons why these fluctuations occur. It could be due to a combination of factors, such as changes in area, vegetation, community shifts, precipitation patterns, or land management. It's also worth pointing out here, as mentioned before, that this graph is for biomass and that the emissions from soil carbon, which do vary over time, are a consistent sink of emissions as seen on the previous slide. Next slide, we'll go through the summary of findings. Oregon's grasslands are functioning as a net carbon sink. They're actively removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, particularly soil carbon. We see significant regional annual variation in carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere by grassland biomass. Below ground biomass stores twice as much carbon as what we see above ground, and this 2-to-1 ratio fundamentally changes how we should think about grassland management. While grazing affects the above ground vegetation, the real climate benefit depends on protecting the soil health and protecting those grasslands. Moving on to future improvements. We have two major improvements. The first is to enhance the NLCD classification by integrating rangeland and grassland mapping products. By cross-referencing several data sources, this will reduce the uncertainties and create a more consistent time series for tracking Oregon's grassland trends. This misclassification inflates inherent grassland area and creates artificial variability in our rangeland inventory time series. So that's why we didn't include it in land converted to grassland from forest. We also recommend using ground verification for the NLCD as a future improvement. And finally, we recommend collecting county level data on grazing practices such as grazing start dates, end dates, and rest periods. And with that, I think we'll move on to Q&A.
That's right, thanks. We have one question here for a quick answer for now, and then we'll move on in the interest of time. Remember, hopefully we'll still have some time for Q&A at the end. This is just what depth was soil carbon estimated for grasslands, e.g. 0 to 30 centimeters below surface?
I need to go and confirm that. I should know that off the top of my head, but I don't. I will put the answer in the chat here as we move forward.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate that, Robert. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on. Ray, I see that you have a question, but we'll get to it on the next round if that's okay. And we actually might just answer your question in the chat too, because we're a little bit behind time at this point. Thanks.
Hi, you get to hear from me again. And I'll give you a brief overview of the results for the developed land. This category includes land that is classified as open space, low, medium, and high intensity development areas. About 80% of the area in Oregon falls under the category of open space and low intensity development land. For the inventory, we're estimating carbon fluxes from urban trees, emissions from drained organic soils that occur, as well as biomass and mineral soil carbon fluxes due to land conversions. The data sources that we're using are similar to those that you've already heard about. They're listed here on the slide as well. One specific data source that hasn't been mentioned yet that I wanted to point out is the additional NLCD data product on tree canopy cover in urban areas that was used in the calculation approach. Next slide, please. So here we have the summary of carbon fluxes within developed areas between 1990 and 2024. The 4 key components are shown. The urban trees and drained organic soils representing the major carbon pools and emission sources on these landscapes, as well as biomass emissions due to conversion of land, and mineral soil fluxes that also occurred during conversion. For urban trees, they act as a carbon sink, consistently removing CO2 from the atmosphere through growth and maintenance of biomass. The sink has increased modestly over time from 1.33 to 1.74 million metric tons of CO2e. This reflects a gradual expansion of developed areas. So the larger the area, the more trees on it, the more they accumulate. After 2016, the tree cover decrease that is observed on open spaces is leading to a decline in sequestration. For drained organic soils, they are acting as a consistent emission source, opposite to the urban trees. And this is due to the decomposition of soil organic matter after drainage. We have a pretty stable emission source here. It increased slightly from 2.3 to 2.85 million metric tons due to, again, an increase in area of developed lands and therefore increase in area of drained organic soils. Biomass carbon flux from conversion usually results in CO2 emissions because biomass is lost. And these emissions were at 1.3 million metric tons in 1990 and decreased to about 0.7 million metric tons, mainly because the area of forest that appears to be converted into developed land has been done so at a slower rate. And then soils actually act as a small sink when land is converted to settlement. Mainly this is due to a large proportion of land being classified as open space in Oregon, and therefore these types of landscapes are actively managed with usually having perennial vegetation cover and high level of inputs. Next slide, please. I just wanted to spend 1 extra minute on urban trees and show a more detailed breakdown by different land development classes. This graph here highlights that the open space areas really dominate the tree-related removals of CO2. And again, overall, the increase up to 2016 is related to increase in area, but we see a small decline in the removals after 2016 because canopy cover decreased in open spaces, though the reason why that occurred would require a little bit more investigation. Next slide, please. So developed lands are a net emitter, and while we have urban trees removing carbon, the emissions from drained organic soils and land conversions are larger in magnitude, and so net emissions are estimated. These findings emphasize the value of maintaining and expanding urban tree cover, and of course the challenge of persistent soil emissions in developed environments. I think another takeaway here is that by conducting field studies, we can refine emission parameters for organic soils and get a better handle on the accuracy of those estimates in the future. And segueing to future improvements on the next slide. Oh, something happened with the slides here, but I could tell you about the future improvements without the text. Anyways, so I think main improvement areas have to do with improving emission parameters that will give a better estimate of emissions for different types of urban tree conditions and types. And so enhancing the tree cover data and data already being collected by Oregon Department of Forestry at the state level on urban trees would be really great to see in the future. And then again, coming back to drained organic soils, refining those parameters and understanding a little bit better what type of drainage, extent of the drainage, et cetera, would really help improve the accuracy of the estimates. With that, I'm happy to turn it over to Lena Capice to talk about Oregon wetlands.
Awesome. Thank you, Olga. My name is Lena, and I'm going to walk us through the wetland results. So to get estimates and removals of greenhouse gases for wetlands, we used a single methodology that allowed us to determine the area of wetland by tidal status. So whether it was coastal or inland wetland, wetland class, soil type, and ecoregion. We also determined the greenhouse gas fluxes in and out of those same areas. So with that data in hand, we calculated the emissions and removals of carbon dioxide from biomass, dead organic matter, and soils, as well as methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions separately. The data in carbon, the area data and carbon flux data are derived from multiple data sources, including the NOAA Coastal Change Analysis Program, the Pacific Marine and Estuarine Fish Habitat Partnership, the Nature Conservancy, the Pacific Northwest Blue Carbon Working Group, as well as IPCC and literature. And this methodological approach typically uses Tier 2 data. Next slide. So the first thing I want to point out is that when we look at the trends in total coastal area of wetland in black, and then inland wetland in orange, we find that wetland area has been fairly consistent over time. There have been no major declines or increases since the 1990s. And while we know that Oregon has lost a significant portion of its wetlands, this mostly occurred prior to the 1900s, in the 18th and early 19th century, when land was converted for agricultural or farmland and development. The second thing that I want to point out is that the area of coastal wetland is around 10 times smaller than inland wetland. And so this has implications for the total magnitude of summed emissions and removals from these ecosystem types. Next slide. Okay, so when we look at the breakdown of emissions and removals on coastal wetlands, which we're showing here with this table and figure, we can see that in 1990, biomass, dead organic matter, and soils and methane all contributed to emissions, whereas in 2024, biomass and dead organic matter contributed to removals, and soils and methane contributed to net emissions. While carbon dioxide is removed from the atmosphere and stored in biomass and dead organic matter, as well as soils, when these habitats are conserved as tidally connected wetlands, the conversion of wetlands to open water through degradation or dealing with some sort of remnant hydrological issue, that actually reverses this process. So when wetlands drown or fragment biomass and organic matter, as well as soil carbon stocks, become exposed and they're oxidized, which ultimately leads to an emission of carbon dioxide. And so this is the mechanism that is underlying coastal wetlands emission trends we see, and likely reflect the decades of hydrologic instability and subsidence associated with diking or tide gating practices. But as you can see, pressures from these impacts have decreased and have become more stable. And that's probably due to restoration efforts and better coastal management practices. And the reduction in emissions from soils and increase in emissions from biomass and dead organic matter in 2024 is probably driven by less wetland being converted to open water. And I should say that methane emissions are fairly constant across the time series, and you can see that here in this dark green, I believe, color, dark blue color on the plot. And this is driven by the vast aerial extent of brackish, close to freshwater wetlands within the coastal zone that have higher methane emissions than saline wetlands. Next slide. Okay, so now we're looking at the emission and removals across inland wetlands. And when we look at the breakdown of emissions in inland wetlands, we can see that in 1990, biomass, dead organic matter, and soils all contributed to removals of all contributed to removals of greenhouse gases, and methane contributed to emissions. And then by 2024, we can see that there's been a slight increase in the net removals from biomass, dead organic matter, and soils, and then methane has remained fairly consistent. So like in coastal wetlands, the conversion of biomass, dead organic matter, and soil in inland wetlands is critical to balance out methane emissions. We can go to the next slide. So some of you may be familiar with, but the previous blue carbon inventory that Oregon carried out. So compared to that one, this inventory now includes tidally connected and non-tidally connected wetlands in the coastal zone. And this results in a 2 times increase in the total mapped wetland extent on the coast. However, this also means that we are accounting for emissions from impounded wetlands. While tidally connected coastal wetlands are in net sink, methane emissions from brackish and freshwater wetlands and the conversion of wetland to open water offset these removals. So continued restoration and conservation is really critical to mitigate the impacts of methane. Our results also indicate that while inland soils and biomass remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, these removals are offset by methane emissions. And so as more data become available for the state on inland wetland carbon fluxes, as well as wetland habitat extent, this estimate may shift, especially for regions in the eastern part of the state where the conditions are drier and methane emissions, the way we've estimated them, might not be as high. Next slide. So there are several future improvements that I want to highlight. In general, better spatial data and more refined carbon data will improve the inventory accuracy. There are a couple new data sets, including a state-wide salinity map that are currently being produced and expected in early 2026. The Wetland Intrinsic Potential tool is expected on a similar timeline and will improve the accuracy and the accuracy of mapped wetlands. And work from Laura Brophy and the Nature Conservancy, if harmonized with the current workflow, will help to improve the representation and counting of impounded wetlands as well as restored wetlands. Additionally, more data related to carbon fluxes on inland wetlands is forthcoming, although this remains a significant data gap. While there is really good regional data available to estimate carbon fluxes from eelgrass meadows, mudflats, and kelp forests, we didn't include that in this current inventory. And there are several harmonization and validation steps that need to take place before we can actually do that. And then finally, transitioning toward a tier 3, more spatially explicit modeling framework could help reduce some of the uncertainty in our methodology and also better represent local conditions. And I think I'm back to Katie.
Actually, we're going to do Q&A. We're going to do Q&A on the wetlands and the built and developed land. We don't seem to have any questions right now in the chat. So since we are behind on time and we want to preserve as much time at the end as possible, I think we'll go ahead and move us on unless I see any hands go up or burning questions, which I don't see right now. So we can move on to Katie.
Great, thank you. This is, we're kind of coming back to where we started from to look at the overall inventory results here at the end. And just to remind you that everything that we've just presented category by category is rolled up into this summary picture of the inventory results. And I just want to reiterate the key findings from from the inventory, and I've lost my notes here. Get them back.
Katie,
So yes.
Katie, while you're getting your notes back, Jennifer, there's like a little window that, yeah, perfect. Thank you. You're good to go. She just read my mind, apparently.
Excellent. Well, I found my notes in the meantime. So just to remind you of the key takeaways, what you see in this figure is that more carbon dioxide is being removed from the atmosphere and stored in biological carbon pools in both forests and grasslands, and to developed lands, those urban trees, as well as some of the perennial vegetation and croplands. That's being removed and stored. And more of that happens than is emitted to the atmosphere from other categories such as fertilization and methane emissions from soils, methane and nitrous oxide emissions. So overall, the land in Oregon is a net sink of greenhouse gases. That sink has been declining over time. There could be some explanations for that. Due to what's happening in the land and land management and climate change, but there also could be some explanations related to data uncertainty looking back in time. Primarily, the sequestration trend is driven by the very unique forests of the Pacific Northwest, their ability to grow and sequester biomass, and then the harvesting of that biomass and its lasting carbon stores over time in durable products. So those are the drivers of the sequestration. Some of the main sources of emissions are draining of organic soils for cropland management and development. There are emissions of methane from wetlands, but there are also compensated by carbon sequestration in wetland soils. Wildfires and prescribed burns are a source of emissions that are important to monitor over time. And finally, the National Land Cover data set, while incredibly valuable for this process, has limitations, and so further data resources are worth exploring, as well as more research on regional or sort of locally specific to Oregon carbon dynamics and emissions dynamics in order to maybe move some of the methods from tier 1 to tier 2 and tier 3. And that is my synthesis. I think I'm going to pass it back to Oregon. There's another slide for me next, but I think I've said all these points, but we can move to that slide and let's have a quick look.
All right, thank you very much, project team. So we have a couple of things we want to talk about regarding what we've learned and accomplished over the course of making this inventory, and a few points regarding these accomplishments and lessons. So through previous work in Oregon, we already had some information on emissions and removal on forest land and coastal wetlands, such as through Department of Forestry's forest carbon assessments. But through this work, we now have information on emissions and removals related to the rest of the land categories across all of Oregon. And so we were also able to include new data and methods developed by Oregon's Blue Carbon Working Group that was not available in previous analysis, and as Lena talked about in the presentation on wetlands. Additionally, we have started to identify questions that can be asked once you have the statewide view of emissions and removals from the land, which this inventory can also help answer. This is exciting for us and our land managing partners. And finally, we don't yet have all the answers to the questions raised by the inventory results, but we are authoring some initial thoughts in the numbered list on the screen here. So first, land use in Oregon has stayed relatively consistent over the last 35 years, which is in large part due to Oregon's unique land use system. Even so, change has occurred. Continued protection of Oregon's unique land use laws could be an important carbon strategy into the future, as it is keeping emissions from changing, or is keeping emissions lower due to keeping lands in the same category, especially compared with other states. So second, acres impacted by wildfire across many land categories have increased substantially over the inventory period. And this has affected above ground carbon stores most notably. However, when fires are severe enough, they can also reduce carbon stored in soils. It is important for us to continue our efforts to reduce the scale and intensity of catastrophic wildfire in the state of Oregon. And third, though this presentation was mostly concerned with emissions and removals, it is also important to consider the protection of carbon that is already stored in the land. If this carbon is not protected, then it is converted to emissions when that land is disturbed. Next slide, please. And so we wanted to make a few final points about each of the land categories as we've been thinking about them. So for forest lands, global research has established that forests are substantial sinks of carbon. And we found in this inventory, as you've seen, that Oregon forests contribute substantially to the state's net carbon removal numbers. So the forests, the Pacific Northwest, and in particular in the western portion of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, we have some of the highest carbon stores and rates of removal in the nation. The inventory also highlights the need to protect existing stores and to manage our working forests in ways that increase net sequestration, especially where that helps us achieve other state environmental and industry goals. And the decline in contribution from Oregon's forests over the inventory period raises significant concerns and questions. Katie spoke about some potential sources of this decline during her presentation, including the inaccuracy of data from this period, which we plan to investigate. Furthermore, the Oregon Department of Forestry is nearly finished with a new assessment of forest carbon using somewhat different methods from those that we used, and we will be working closely with them for future inventory improvements of this inventory, as well as to help understand the trends that we're seeing to be able to verify the results that we are finding across our two efforts. The decline in the contribution, I'm sorry, I already said that, on lands managed to produce forest products, increasing net sequestration in forests ultimately can result in more fiber per acre, which is important to Oregon's economy and communities. However, due to the long-term nature and complexity of changing forest harvest rotations in these forests, increasing sequestration will require careful consideration and support. For croplands, cropland is currently a source of emissions, largely due to emissions from drained organic soils. And so this aligns with what we know about how Oregon was settled. Much of Oregon's land, not just the lands currently used for agriculture, were drained to create productive soil conditions or developable land. Perennial crops are balanced between their emissions and removals. They currently are not a major source or sink. And given the importance of drained organic soils to our cropland net emissions, returning unproductive cropland to wetlands may be useful for meeting our emission goals for the land, especially as we consider the additional benefits of restoration, such as improving resilience to drought and providing habitat for insects that are beneficial to neighboring cropland. Under grasslands, so grasslands in Oregon are usually a net sink, but their carbon flux can vary depending on soils, topography, precipitation, and disturbance history. And that's why you saw them shifting over time between sinks and sources of emissions. The National Land Cover Database classifies grasslands into 3 different vegetation types, but does not do a good job of distinguishing between these types in Oregon. Furthermore, some grasslands in Oregon are likely misclassified as hay or pasture, which would normally follow under cropland in a better system. So speaking of grassland types, perennial bunchgrass dominated grasslands store much more carbon than non-native annual grass dominated grasslands that establish after significant disturbance. So in this analysis, the difference in carbon stores between perennial and annual grass dominated lands could not be distinguished because of the data that we used. Additionally, data was not available for grazing intensity. So in this analysis, we had to rely on expert opinion. Better mapping and research are critical for characterizing grassland in future inventory analyses. And these grasslands cover a large area of Oregon. And we want to promote both of these in order to sort of achieve our desired level of estimate accuracy. Next slide, please. For developed land is not developed land is a net source of emissions, with urban trees acting as a sink, but urban drained soils or historic wetlands in these areas acting as a source of emissions. And so restoring historic wetlands in urban areas and avoiding further degradation to current wetlands in developing areas is important as we look to floodplain and wetland restoration as natural ways to protect communities from increasing flood risks. We will gain both nature-based adaptation and mitigation benefits. Similarly, urban tree canopy cover offers both of these kinds of benefits, both adaptation and mitigation. For example, tree canopy may reduce energy demand for heating and cooling under changing Oregon climates. Urban tree expansion or urban afforestation as a promising area for meeting nature-based resilience, equity, adaptation, and mitigation goals. For wetlands, overall, wetlands are reported as an emission source, although it's small relative to other land categories. However, as with other land categories, the story is complex. In coastal wetlands, for example, restored or tidally connected wetlands are a sink. Forested tidal wetlands, while small in overall acreage in Oregon, are actually on par with the state's mature forests in terms of their sequestration and storage potential. Conversely, historic coastal wetlands, which are often behind dikes or disconnected from tidal flow, are net sources of emissions. Non-tidal or inland freshwater wetlands are a larger source of emissions. We note that the science behind the carbon dynamics of inland wetlands is still young and developing, and new research on inland wetlands is coming out of the University of Washington, who we've been in contact with throughout this project, which will help us better identify and understand the dynamics of inland wetlands, hopefully in future inventory analysis as that research continues. Importantly, we also know that net emissions from wetlands are dominated by the contributions of methane, which is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. I said earlier that it was it's a carbon dioxide equivalent of 28, so it's 28 times the global warming potential. However, wetlands still sequester and store carbon even while emitting methane. Wetlands add carbon to their soils every year in a relatively small spatial extent on the landscape compared to other land covered types. The protection of wetlands, even with their natural methane emissions, is critical to avoid losing carbon stocks and generating more emissions. Furthermore, restoring wetlands could greatly benefit Oregon, not just in terms of carbon removal and storage services, but also to improve water quality, drought resilience, flood hazard mitigation, and more. And finally, on biomass burning, wildfires have been increasing in frequency and area in forests and grasslands in Oregon. The amount of emissions they create depends heavily on the type of land being burned, with forest burning resulting in high emissions. Fuel reduction may result in the loss of biomass and dead organic matter on different lands in Oregon, but they may result in additional storage in forests in the long term if these actions prevent large and catastrophic burns. Also, burns interact with other stressors in the land, such as the encroachment of non-native grasses or non-native annual grasses specifically, to reduce carbon stores even after grass returns to the land after burns. There are recent studies in Oregon on this dynamic, and therefore opportunities to foster collaborations with Oregon researchers and practitioners to better understand, protect, and restore carbon in Oregon's grasslands. And so with that, I am ending today's presentation from the project team. Thank you again to everyone who has worked on this and for your time, and we will open up for our final period for questions. Thank you.
Yes, I feel like after almost 2 hours of content, feel free to take a stretch, do a little twist, think about what questions you might have. We really love getting the questions in the chat so that we have them easily to look at again as we're answering them, but feel free to raise your hand if that's a better fit for you. I'll keep an eye out for that. We do have a question. How was uncertainty addressed? Oh, wait, sorry, another question came in and moved it. Okay. How was uncertainty assessed within the inventory? Were any confidence intervals established for the emissions and removals reported? We have a lot of folks on the line that could answer that question, I think. So I'm not sure who might be the best person. Katie, did you just come off mute?
I did. I may not be the best person, but I am the best one to get us started. I think each land lead has been able to do this quantitatively and qualitatively to various extents. It sort of depends on the methodology and the data available. Doing analysis of uncertainty is certainly an important part of our work. And I'm going to turn it over to the leads to sort of volunteer and offer how they've done it individually for their sections.
Yeah, we don't need to hear from everyone, but if any, we can, but happy to hear from any of you.
Maybe the wetlands folks. Lena, maybe you can say something about this to put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. Yeah, so for wetlands, we follow a tier 1 IPCC approach 1. And so basically, we look at the confidence interval from using the standard deviation and sample numbers of all the aggregated data. So looking across our carbon stocks, our carbon burial rates, and getting a 95% confidence interval on that. And then we basically sum all of the uncertainty together and get a uncertainty for that like tabular carbon flux data as well as the activity data. I think NLCD, which everyone is using, has a reported like 15% uncertainty on land cover, could be less. So like we take that number and sum it with the other uncertainties.
Great, thanks for providing that example. Anyone else want to speak up about this before we move on to our next question?
I'll just say that this is an active area of development in the inventory report right now. I think in the report that's available online, I might, Liz, correct me if I'm wrong, but in that report, we haven't been able to populate the sections on uncertainty that's coming. So we are working on that actively now.
That is correct.
Great.
I will pop the appendix for the methods in the chat too.
Perfect. Thank you for doing that. Ray asked a question that's related, and then I'll go back to Grace's question. Ray's wondering if we've been able to propagate the NLCD change detection error rates.
Let me just try to answer that. No, we haven't been able to propagate error right now because we just documented what we have mostly on quantitative way. We didn't have all the information or time to do error propagation because the NLCD data gives land cover map has the accuracy about 75 to 85%, and it varies by different land class types. And for the especially in the forest sector, for the carbon densities, there is some standard errors given in the FIA plots, but we haven't been able to do error propagation using models like Monte Carlo for now.
Okay, great. Thanks. And we actually are coming up with quite a few questions at this point. So I'm going to go to Grace next. Grace is wondering, in the forest and grassland carbon flux estimates, so our friends who worked on forests and grassland, are carbon losses from biomass burning reported separately, or are they only incorporated into the net values?
Maybe I can take that. They are incorporated where the carbon density parameters allow that, reflect that, which may or may not be everywhere. And so only the methane and nitrous oxide emissions from grasslands and forest land wildfires are reported separately.
Okay, thank you. Bobby, thank you all for the great presentation. I concur, Bobby. This is all new to me. Learned a ton. His question is the lack of state statute definitions for the inventory, ooh, I think this is going to be a question for Liz. Is the lack of state statute definitions for the inventory land categories a potential limiting factor in terms of either state policy and or funding opportunities? Why or why not?
Wow, Bobby. Good question. Let me think on this for a little bit. So I think it's fabulous that we have a definition for natural and working lands in statute, which kind of hits on all of the land categories that the inventory is built on. And so I don't think we would need a specific, appendix. I forget which appendix it is, actually talks about the thresholds of where we cut off which land category to go where for this inventory. And that is much too, I think that's too technical for policy needs. So I think the natural working lands definition that we have will probably meet most of our policy needs. I think considering funding opportunities, we're grateful to have the Natural and Working Lands Fund. It supports additional research when money is appropriated from the legislature, as well as implementation of natural climate solutions. So that just comes up like even more important as we look to try and improve this inventory over time. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. That was a big question.
I guess I'll also just add because like what I do know a lot about is passing legislation, especially in Oregon. And I feel like getting into the weeds, wow, which really in this particular like topic actually fits, but getting into the weeds on defining something like the land categories for an inventory like this, it strikes me as almost dangerously outside the expertise of the legislators who'd be making the decision. And it's the kind of thing I could see if you wanted to define it, it would be best if like something like this were to make those definitions and then kind of have it be sent back to the legislature if there is a reason or if it is helpful to have it defined. So I'll just like put that out there that I just think it would be one of those things where it could get political. And this is like a pretty, you have to be pretty in-depth and knowledgeable about this topic, right? And so I don't know. I will just add that, even though it's kind of an incomplete thought. I'd be worried about them from setting it personally. But let's see. Dean's wondering if there are he's making a comment. It seems like there are recurring questions that stem from the separation of emissions from the land inventory versus the sector inventory. And he thinks it may lead to confusion and difficulty for end users of the report. Are there any plans to mesh emission estimates, e.g. provide emission estimates from cropland that include both biomass removal and tractor emissions?
I mean, I think the team could answer this, but no, there are no plans right now. If the project team wants to speak to how that is broken up in the guidelines and the categories, please feel free to do so. But right now, just speaking more broadly to DEQ and Odo getting together and making one grand inventory, we haven't talked about that. But even so, there would still be explicit categories and subcategories. So, but that's where I would need to hand it to the team to talk about the categories. And then I'll put the, to illustrate what they might say, I'll put the appendix that kind of lists all the subcategories that we created for the report in order to clarify this point, Dean.
Great.
Project team?
Anyone else have any thoughts on this one?
I mean, I can jump in. I think that's really a question for the state of Oregon, whether or not you want to move in that direction. So, but from a technical standpoint, the information exists in both places, and we've been careful not to duplicate and double count. So supplementary work could be done to combine the information. I think the information is there for policymakers. It is complicated to have to look between two reports, but we've been careful to make them compatible. And so I would just offer that they do complement each other, even though it could be confusing and difficult.
Great. All right. Dean seems satisfied. Appreciate your thanks. I'm gonna oh look, we have another one. Oh, nope, that's Liz putting in the appendix that covers the categories. I'm just gonna check and see if anybody has a hand raised. I don't think so. And then we still have a few more minutes here. I'm happy to answer any more questions. So I don't see any more in the chat, but we'll all be sticking around and we'll see if anybody else has any. And if we have maybe let's say 3 minutes with no questions, we might wrap up early. Hey, Friday afternoon. So we'll just chill here for a few minutes and see if there's any other. Oh, here we go, Ray. Oh no, Ray's just excited. Thanks, Ray. The webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the website. And we're going to go to the next slide if we can. So as people start slipping off, we make sure they have the vital information on this slide, but we're still happy to take questions. So our plan is to have comments all come in by December 19th to Liz's email address, which is elizabeth.ruther@energy.oregon.gov, which is on your screen right now. We need to get those in time to get those comments reflected or evaluated and reflected by the time the report is due at the end of the year on December 31st. So we'd love to hear from you now that you've kind of gotten the download here, or download here. And so please be in touch, and then I'll keep an eye on the chat. No more questions at this point. Commence awkward silence.
Can I use this?
Put a link. Oh, we could also put a link into the, for those that are still hanging around, a link to the website where they can find the recording for this and find the report again that we shared at the beginning.
On it.
Thanks, Liz.
I was going to offer to use this space as an opportunity to address a question that came up at the very beginning about the decision to not include estimates for conversions of forest land to grassland and what the implications of that were for the estimates. And I don't recall, I don't recall the name of the person asking the question and if they're still on the line, but I'm happy to try and address that, or the team can try and address that question now. I'm not sure we got to it in the discussions. He was maybe calling in.
That was Tim.
Tim?
Yeah, I'll see if he's still here. He is maybe? I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I don't want to complicate matters and go on a long explanation. I think the answers to his questions were in the inventory report, and certainly the team can provide more technical background information as needed to Liz and team when they receive the written comments if something comes up.
Great. Thanks for remembering that.
Yeah.
I'll just remind, I'll take the opportunity to remind folks that along with this public comment period, we will be publishing the Natural Climate Solutions Workforce Study on Monday. And I think I misspoke earlier that public comment period will be from December 8th to December 22nd. And yeah, I just wanted to put that out there. Bookends.
We do have a lingering question from Ray about number one, is the webinar recorded? And the answer
Oh,
is
yes, I did.
yes.
I thought I said it would be posted on the website.
Oh, my bad.
But I might have gotten distracted midway through and been like, put the link in, which actually I think we then didn't technically put the link into where the video would end up because it just took the words and not the link. So we could just repost that if we want.
Really? That keeps happening. I don't understand. Okay.
It's like too smart.
Okay. Well, shoot.
If you Google like Odo and natural climate solutions, you'll find it.
I know. We'll do that before this ends. I've done it before. Maybe it's Microsoft Edge. It was coming up in Microsoft Edge. Maybe that's, I'll blame that. Okay.
Great.
There. Great.
So yeah, Ray, that's where the video will be posted. Great. I think we've done it. I think we've waited. There are no new questions. We can stick around if we want, but
that's okay.
Also happy to end it whenever you're ready, Liz.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, everyone. Thank you, project team, for everything that you've shared today. Thank you for all the great questions to people who attended and sticking it out to the end. And please do contact us if you have more questions, and we look forward to your comments. Have a great day.
Have a great weekend.